So again, thank you all for joining us today. As my colleague Dina mentioned, my name is Jawad Dukhgan. Dukhgan seems nice, but it's Dukhgan. I'm an architect and a curator based in Amman, and currently I'm working with the UN Habitat on a climate change project. I'd like to welcome you today to today's first session of the MENA Housing Forum. This session aims at raising questions as well as discussing existing technology solutions, tools, and practices, either arising from the MENA region or that can be applied to its geographical area, and that can be implemented towards achieving a resilient housing sector. The format of this session will be a series of short conversations with each speaker, rather than presentations, where each speaker will address the term resiliency from their own lens and perspective based on how they operate within their institutions and organizations, and what it means when it comes to resilient housing and resiliency in general. So the way it's going to go, I'm going to invite the speaker and ask them questions, and also as a panelist will reflect on his answers basically and on his topic. Of course, we are grateful to our panelists for agreeing to be part of this discussion. And I would also like to thank our colleagues at Habitat for Humanity for actually inviting us and putting up this beautiful event. Now, before I start, I would like to briefly welcome our panelists. Later on, I'll introduce them more thoroughly. But for now, this morning, we have the following panelists joining us. We have Fawaz, who is an associate professor of urban planning and studies at the Department of Architecture and Design at the American University of Beirut. We have Momen El-Husseiny, who is an assistant professor in architecture, urban design at the American University of Cairo, AUC. We have Mohammad Asfour, who is the chair of Wadi NGO. We have Wijdan Alsharif, who is the CEO of the Green Building Council, Palestine Green Building Council. And Luis Triveno, who's joining us virtually, is a senior urban development specialist at the World Bank. As you all noticed by now, we all operate from kind of different institutions. And when we had our first discussions, we were talking about this topic, resiliency. We understood it would be a bit difficult to talk about individual projects, but rather reflect on how we work and how we operate from our institutions. Now, it goes without saying that communities, cities, and nations have been confronted with a myriad of urban challenges, including inequality, urban density, lack of adequate physical and social infrastructure, access to affordable housing, as well as environmental and ecological risks. The recent global and regional events, whether we're talking about the pandemic, global food security, political events taking place, they have exposed and aggravated these challenges, and measures to contain and mitigate and adapt to such global and regional events have disrupted public life, altered social coherence, and exposed how the built environment was already affected. Such mitigation and adaptation attempts also reveal cities' interdependent infrastructure, the social and ecosystems, and their interconnected vulnerabilities. In light of the recent events, this session will examine how cities, citizens, organizations, institutions, and governments can respond, transform, and improve during such times. This session will bring experts together. It's huge, I don't care. This session will bring experts together to discuss what is required to avert the indirect sociocultural, ecological, and economical impact that may result when urban life is affected, what city recovery response strategies centered on inclusive and sustainable models are needed to address such challenges, and what are the lessons learned from previous work on urban resilience in terms of mobility, density, housing, and urban design. The speakers will explore how and if global agendas can be reconciled with the communities, cities, and nations' needs to pave pathways for sustainable, resilient development, and how they envision future of cities' urban life. I want to check where is the clicker. How can we control it? Yeah, you know. Shukran. Yeah, I'm going back. So during yesterday, past day, the speakers participated, reflected on housing issues, and shared with us action plans, tools, solutions, and projections that are in place to tackle the challenges that cities are currently facing and how to contain what seems like playing catch up with housing. During a conversation I was having with Muna, it reminded me with, the photo is not clear, but the photo is a master thesis in the late 50s of an architect, a Jordanian architect who was pursuing his master's degree at MIT. So it discusses residential housing and planning. So what came to my mind from yesterday, from all of the speakers, we're sharing all of these kind of ideas and mitigation plans and action plans on how to deal with what we are facing now. But what we are facing now, we have been facing it some time ago. We're not new to economic crisis. We're not new to forced migration. However, what we're facing every day is more and more challenges, and we're trying to understand how to kind of approach them, identify them, and move forward. So it was interesting for me that in late 50s, in the 50s, in Jordan, what we called it was the time of the city of planners, because what happened is in the 50s, you have the first kind of Westernly trained planners coming back to Jordan. So hence, you can see, like, for example, I took this master thesis example in the late 50s, and the author is saying, basically, I want to go back and read it here. He was saying that this thesis seeks to strike a difficult balance between what the author feels to be minimum standards for, quote unquote, for application to create a healthy environment, and an apparent conflict between what would be like to see happen and what private enterprise, as it now operates in Jordan, can in fact achieve. The chapter headings themselves reveal the scope of inquiry, the neighborhood unit, dwelling types, standard of occupancy, size of dwellings, density of residential development. In prelude, the writer explores the present situation in Jordan vis-a-vis planning, sets general goals, and runs through brief analysis of the spatial and economic context in which planning must operate. Now, you have to bear in mind, in the 50s, in 1947, Amman's population was around 33,000. And in the early 50s, it became around 200,000. So here you have the population is not doubling, tripling, quadrupling, almost even more. Going through the table of contents of this author. So you can see lots of similarities of what we have been discussing the past day. We're looking at the issues, the problems that are arising from housing is because there are low standard of living, rapid increased population, lack of control of development. The author also discusses the standard of occupancy, size of dwellings, and density of residential development, talking also about development. This table shows basically how the number of structures in Amman at the time. This is in 1952. So if you take a look at Amman on the top, you have the Bedouin tents and other tents and caves. It makes 30% of the population of Amman were living in tents and caves at the time. So hence you now also, like before, there's a need for housing, but it was also how we, approach it. This photo is the first comprehensive master plan of Amman. It was developed in 1955. So I was curious about understanding how our cities, our Arab cities, were kind of evolving. So the more you delve deeper, the more you understand that the British town planning influence and French also planning influence was affecting our region. So I wanted to locate this plan in specific. I couldn't find it in Jordan. I couldn't. No one even knew about it. Maybe two people knew about it, and they didn't want to share with me from where they got it. This photo was taken by the nice librarian at the University of Westminster at the Max Lock Archive Center. Max Lock was the urban planner who planned Amman at the time. I'm not going to talk a lot about the details of this master plan. However, in the north of the city, there's a refugee camp there. It's called El-Husseiny refugee camp, having the Palestinian refugees. And right next to it is a proposal of having golf courses. So here you can see that also development is playing a role of how do you modernize city, a new city-state, a nation. On the western part, this plan is based on the 7 hills of Amman. On the west part, there's a small kind of allocation of water catchment area. So as the planner says, valleys or wadis, he mentioned the wadis are naturally irrigated. So he allocated all of the valley as a central park for water catchment area, which now we can kind of refer to as nature-based solutions. So basically what we do over the years is use those terms, and I don't want to say recycle them in a way, but in each and every decade, there are terms that we use in order to reach a specific goal, whether it's resilience, whether it's vernacular architecture, whether it's nature-based solutions. The reason why I shared this is because I was jealous yesterday. No one talked about Amman. You talked about the beautiful cities in Tunis, Maghreb, Lebanon, so I needed to put Amman somewhere on the map. And so now, as different institutions and organizations, whether financial, educational, or environmental, try to address and mitigate the short and long-term impacts of regional and global events, emergencies on economies, societies, and the environment, on economies, societies, and the environment, it is essential that policymakers also focus on how the recent events have exacerbated already existing concerns about the urban life, including social inequality, deterioration in urban infrastructure, and stressed ecosystem. In addition, our focus during this session will not be on our research and projects, but reflecting on organizations, institutions we operate from, and the parameters of our impact and interventions. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker for today, Luis Triveno. He's a senior urban development specialist at the World Bank, where he leads the global program for resilient housing. He has led and executed social, urban, and rural development reform projects in over 25 countries in Europe, Asia, and Africa, and Latin America. Between 2012 and 2015, he was Chief Executive Officer of Pro-Expansion, a think tank and reform-oriented organization based in Lima, Peru. Between 2005 and 2012, he served as a research economist, chief operating officer, and chief executive officer of Hernando de Soto's Institute for Liberty and Democracy. Now, during our virtual conversation with Luis, he began giving a brief definition of what is resilience and how it is both physical and institutional. And when thinking about housing policies or crisis response, we need to think about a country's capability to develop a range of housing options for a range of needs, or what you mentioned called housing capacity. Now, before handing it to you, Luis, I would like to remind you that we are all be going over the 5 brief presentations, followed by a short discussion after each presentation among the panelists, and then in the end, we'll open it up to the audience. Thank you again to everyone in our virtual audience also, and please join me in welcoming Luis Triveno. Please go ahead, Luis.
Thank you very much for this invitation to Habitat for Humanity, and hello to everybody from Jakarta, all the panelists there. I think the introduction that you just made is very important, because you are essentially presenting all problems that we haven't been able to solve. All problems that we know for long. So I would like to talk a little bit about what's preventing us to get there. What's preventing us to crack that nut that we have in front of us. And before I go into that, it's important that we agree on why is it so important to crack that nut, no? Because one thing is because housing is climate infrastructure, so it can play a key role in both mitigation and adaptation. After COVID, it has shown that it is also public health infrastructure. It's where people can feel actually safe. It's accessibility infrastructure for people with limited mobility, and it is life-saving infrastructure when facing climate-related events and natural hazards. No, so. And this is mostly taking place in cities, but of course also in rural areas. Now the question is, how can we crack that nut? How can we provide decent, affordable, resilient, green, and inclusive housing in cities? And so the answer I have for you today is that we need to find a delicate balance, no? And we need to find delicate balance because there is a lot that both the construction and the housing sector has not been doing that much in recent years, which is innovating. And it is great to see that institutions like Habitat for Humanity are promoting innovation in the sector. But still, we build the houses the same way we did it for many years in the past. We use the same financial instrument to access our housing. Our 10-year form of having a house is the same as it was decades ago. So in that front, there is a lot of space for innovation. And the second issue is as much as we need to innovate, we also need to get the basics right. The basics that we haven't been able to deal in the first place. And that is about, defining adequate standards, locating the houses that needs to be built and then houses that need to be retrofitted. And then, do it in a proper way. And in that sense, we still have a way to go. And the last part is to overcome our own biases. And I'm going to show you a little bit what I mean by that. So the main approach that we are taking at the World Bank, and the reason why we are focusing on housing capacity, is because, of course, resilience can be seen from the physical infrastructure point of view, but also from the institutional infrastructure. There is an intangible part of how you get resilience done. And that has to do a lot with how you balance your programs, if you really internalize that. Housing, for example, represents 80 to 90% of the building stock, but it only renews at a rate of 1 or 2% per year, which means if you want to achieve resilience, you don't only have to build new resilient homes, you also need to know what to do with the existing stock. Do housing programs all over the world deal with that? Not that frequently, and this is an issue of balancing. So you have to see the second part of it is how once you balance, you need to see housing not only as a piece of infrastructure that needs to be safe, but also as a system. And why do we mean that after a disaster, after an event, we would like to have our transportation system or schools or healthcare system to be able to respond from the next day on, or to start the recovery process as fast as we can, so people can get back to their lives faster. Now, housing needs to do the same thing, and this is what we mean by housing capacity. So governments and the private sector need to be able to deploy in short periods of time in a decentralized way teams that can identify housing conditions and need. They need to exist finance options for home ownership for low and middle income households. There need to be programs for specific needs and vulnerable populations. And overall, this needs to flow in an efficient and fast way. Now, that means you can only, cannot as a country only focus on, for example, access to home ownership through only one instrument, financial instrument, like mortgages, for example. There needs to be space for home improvement. There needs to be space for self-construction. It's very good to promote developers of all sizes, but also community-based efforts with solid standards. And why? This is where I want to end, because there are blind spots in housing policy that are preventing us to reach those that need it the most. For example, families living in high-risk areas are rarely reached by housing programs. Families that do not have adequate property rights, they rarely benefit from government initiatives. Families that are renters, they rarely get support or alternatives. Families that live in overcrowding conditions or in multifamily buildings, they rarely get support from governments, and they rarely take a place as a potential source of business also for private companies. And why? Because the systems that government promote through their programs do not give space for these other options to grow. So just to summarize, it is an important element to have diversified housing programs that operate in a very decentralized way through different forms of implementations, and at the same time that target the vulnerable, the most vulnerable families that typically face conditions that are not considered in traditional housing programs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luis, and thank you for joining us virtually. I guess today what you were discussing right now is something we were tapping to yesterday by several speakers, actually. But also before me saying anything, I would like to ask the panelists here joining us if they have any comments or regarding what Luis was discussing. Because on one hand, Luis, I believe he highlighted like we need to understand the existing infrastructure. Moment, maybe it's something also later on you will touch upon in a way. And then, of course, Mona, yesterday, the relationship between development and the government, and again, this relationship of how do you control the supply and demand and who's involved with the grassroots movements in general. I feel like we are in this huge bowl of different ways of how we operate. And Luis just shared with us the one tool of the World Bank and how they move forward with the towards, or how you say it, housing capacity towards resiliency. Do you have any comments, guys, on that?
Maybe a question for where it's that, I think everybody. Okay, thank you for the presentation. I guess it's just a quick follow-up on asking where it's really worked well. I'm curious just about the fact that we have that aspiration for getting governments to get involved, to prepare those resiliency plans, we support them in that. But is there a good context, particularly of a city in the global south, that we can learn from, where resiliency plans have actually been set ahead with the support of the bank and they've made a big difference?
Thank you. This is a great example. So have these ideas been tested, and this is, of course, housing is a work in progress all over the world. But let me give you an example for the country where I'm based now. In Indonesia. Indonesia has probably one of the largest home improvement programs in the world. They more or less retrofit and improve anywhere between 150,000 to 200,000 homes per year. Now, in the same way as they do it in Asia, in Latin America, you have countries like Mexico, for example, that do more than 100,000 per year as well. Now, if you could influence marginally and ensure that a larger percentage of these units are retrofitted with resilience standards, the impact is massive, even without moving capital. No. Now, if you do what other countries are doing, like countries that do not have large government programs, like Guatemala, for example, a smaller country in Central America, to try to incentivize the microfinance market to expand the microloans for home improvement or self-construction with resilience standards, then that's how you are moving the needle, and it is happening. Habitat for Humanity is behind some of these initiatives, for example, with a microbuild fund, and there are some governments trying to innovate in a similar way. No, there are many more challenges. Another challenge, for example, is the reconstruction industry itself. Many countries have very well-structured housing programs, but every time there is a disaster, the reconstruction work is done differently? Does it have to be that way? When there can be a lot of preparation in advance, not only trying to ensure that houses are not destroyed by disasters, but also that the response is effective. No? Let me give you one example of the case of Chile. After the 2010 earthquake, the first subsidy for reconstruction subsidy was delivered after 3 months. In the last disasters, they do it after 1 week. And this is possible now to make it scalable. So governments need to invest more. This doesn't happen with ideas or just with regulation. It happens with budget. The private sector needs to see the opportunity because the government cannot do it alone. And of course, all experts, you know, we need to move in that direction. And I think these discussions are particularly helpful for raising this issue. Thank you for this question.
Yes, I have a question for you, please. Now, I've seen some of the plans that the World Bank has prepared, including the Amman Climate Action Plan and so on. But what I observe sometimes is that a lot of these plans do not move forward because of the weak structures of governance. Yes, financial tools are required, but they aren't the only solution. So what are you doing to ensure that whenever you intervene, that you also impact the structure of governance that could turn whatever you recommend into a reality?
There is, of course, this is the critical determinant of success, no? The institutional capacity, no? And I think that every country is different, and from the starting point, I think to address this issue is to work with what exists, no? And you see that from housing programs, pre-disaster and post-disaster, that those that work successfully are those that are built organically by the country itself. No, there are some countries in the world that, for example, as I mentioned before, the case of Mexico, no, very private sector oriented, going with developers. You have the case of Indonesia where you have a little bit more balance. There's more community based in Asia work. Is there any right model? And the answer is not straightforward. No, you can get it right working with different operational models. Now, do you need to sacrifice your values, no, the core values? No, do you need to sacrifice on safety of the units? Do you need to sacrifice on inclusion? And the answer, I think, is you don't need to sacrifice. You need to find a way, and that is harder because you have typically more. You need to engage with multiple actors that have different agendas, that have different scales, and that have strong voices. And this is important to engage in that dialogue. But I think with an approach of openness that who has to decide how things are done is, of course, the government. Because that's how they're going to get done, the things get done faster. And then, empower the civil society and the experts and the academia on find the right way. No, now this doesn't need to be, this is a long process, it's a hard process, but it has been done. And the good thing is there are experiences all over the world where things have done differently and have done successfully. No, so we need to bring that. And I think that, probably one of the best contributions of the World Bank is probably not the financing part, but just bringing these global experiences so governments and stakeholders can see that they can achieve things differently and that they can build their own solution without making the mistakes of the past that others have made, and just repeating or doing more imitating the successes of others across the world.
Thank you so much. I'm going to use the term openness of discussion to reflect on a few points that you mentioned. And I think here we were seeing that the calculability of crisis, that there is an underlying tone that 90% of the units were constructed, speed recovery, the reconstruction industry. And I think realizing crisis and recovery from the bandwidth of engineering and scientific solutions as the techno-only solution to reflect that is taking for a de facto that we are in the stage of moving on, rather than looking at the crisis of what emanated in the first place and actually addressing the structural injustices that are rooted in societies and communities, that then actually we can reflect better into the notion of what happens and what could be avoided. And I think this is a very important thing, because there's an important aspect. We are in the aim of good intentions, but that good intentions also can provide elastic security, not solid grounded one. And these are aspects that are going beyond the physical. We can look at how people, the afterlives of people going into that kind of ungrounded, muddy sense of tenure and how they survive. And I think it's important to look at interventionist approaches, strategic versus tactical, surgical and acupuncture, things that are reflected in history, so that then we can offer solutions that maybe are different than the one that we are offering as a quick kind of sheer grounded physical infrastructure, and that's it. So I think what I hear and want to highlight probably is the historical injustices that are preceding the moment that then would ground us, rather than just quick recovery, the language of the mission to save that needs to be a little bit have this kind of historical social science understanding to how people operate in the context, rather than a pre-engineering, preconceived assumptions and going into the ground and just doing it.
Luis, I just want to interrupt if you can be brief with your answer, because
Yes, no, I think I totally agree.
Because
I think
we have still 4 presentations. Thank you, Luis.
this is a very good point, and I think the most important aspect of it is that it's important to be uncomfortable. No, we need to be uncomfortable, and there is a legacy of the of governance and markets promising housing solutions that have not been delivered. No, now the question is why, and I think that is how to address that. And I think part of the solution is to look at what are the places, what are the policies, what are the regulations where we are perpetuating what you call injustices. And I give you just one example to close. And is, for example, regulations that prevent governments to support families living in high-risk areas. Makes a lot of sense, because government budgets should not go to areas that should not be occupied. Now, the question is, if we just leave it there, we are preventing governments to help the families that need it the most. We need to do something else. Okay, this is okay. We build an infrastructure so nobody occupies the land, but where do we give these families housing? Decent housing, close to the jobs. And I think that is a question. And we don't do it, even though we know it's there, because it's hard. And so I think your question raises a super interesting point. We need to feel uncomfortable. We need to find the root of this injustice, and we need to fix them. And the way to fix them will come with a program and aligning the budget and the commitment to deliver solutions to those that need it. Thank you very much. I really like your question.
Thank you so much, Luis. Thank you so much for, giving all of us all this information to us. I'm pretty sure we have actually more questions to you, but I think now we still have like 1 hour. We were half an hour late, so I think we'll finish in 1 hour, and we still have 4 presentations, quick presentations. So Luis, please, we would love to have you involved in the future kind of a presentation now taking place. So please feel free to kind of let us know when you want to ask a question or have an intervention. On a separate note, would it be possible to lower down the AC because it's quite getting like a freezer inside here? That would be good, right? Yeah, in honor of COP. Yeah. So I'm going to move forward now. And again, thank you so much, Louise, for the presentation, for being with us. And now I'm going to move to our next panelist. I'm going to see if we can have the PDF presentation up. So now we're going to move to Momen El-Husseiny. Momen El-Husseiny is an assistant architecture and urban design professor at the American University in Cairo. As a licensed architect since 2003, he has collaborated in the design of several international competitions and projects across the Middle East, including the American University in Cairo's new Cairo campus, particularly the Performance and Visual Arts building with its parking square. He is a trained ethnographer with a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley in architecture, with a designated emphasis on global metropolitan studies and a minor in anthropology. His dissertation compounds of modernity, national order, and the other in Egypt, 1940 present, historizes the formation of compounds from the colonial era till the present neoliberal condition. He lectured at UC Berkeley, the Academy of Arts in San Francisco, and the Arab Academy of Science, Technology, and Maritime Transport. Before we start the moment, I want to kind of tap into our conversation that we had and the information you shared with us. So again, prior to having these conversations today, we had separate conversations to discuss what topics we want to talk about. And the title, Practices Beyond Resilience, is something that I have written. It's not your title, so excuse me if I kind of stepped in, but I felt it would be interesting to kind of discuss that, because before that Luis was talking about how do you reach towards resiliency, what are the tools, but again, practices that are come in parallel with resiliency, what are they? And if you don't mind, Momen, I want to read the brief that you shared with us, and then maybe I'll hand it to you. The neoliberalization of urban institutions dominated the city's operations under terms mostly staged as economic, social, environmentally sustainable, and resilient projects. For those inhabiting cities of the Southern Hemisphere, the urban majority rarely use such framings and lexicon in their everyday life. Instead, they constantly take advantage of such projects to infiltrate, negotiate, and reproduce new possibilities that cannot have been attainable. These hence can be looked upon as spaces of the maybe. Moving beyond the, one thing is that it's here. Sorry. Moving beyond resilience as a noun and status marker with some sort of checkpoints and metrics to achieve, ordinary citizens and urban practices capture inhabitation beyond resilience. Drawing from the geographies of the Blackness and anti-Blackness and emanating from the experiences of suffering and reappropriation in African cities, I look at how citizens unmake, remake, retool, and negotiate the instantiated projects of neoliberal housing in their own terms of everyday habitation. I mean, the text that you write is quite interesting. It again, to me, it highlights like what is going in parallel with this process that sometimes we refer to as resilient, as sustainable. But again, as Luis mentioned before that, we need to understand the already existing infrastructures that are happening on the ground. So without further ado, I want to raise, some questions that you were discussing, and maybe you can reflect back on them, and our colleagues will also add some to the questions. As you mentioned, like sometimes resilient projects serve the agenda of the sponsor grants, and to a lesser degree, the incessant crisis in the surrounding. Hence, what are the new vocab and ontologies to put on the table? This was an interesting question. It would be nice for you to reflect on. Also, in addition, sometimes resilience becomes not about a name on the project per se, but about the citizens' ability to use them for coping, retooling, converting, making, unmaking, and remaking their terms and conditions. So the floor is yours. Please feel free to expand on it. It will be good if you take 5 to 7 minutes, then we give another 3 minutes for questions. Please, everyone, join me in welcoming Dr. Momen El-Husseiny.
Thank you, Jawad. I'm honored to be around amazing scholars that I am a big fan of. So I'm gonna reflect on what do we mean by resilience in the context of the global South, in a context of a city that is a city like Cairo. A few weeks ago, I had a brother and friend, comrade, scholar, Abdul Malik Simoun, visiting Cairo and walked him over the city for 10 days, and he was struck by the immensity of that kind of city, a city that houses 125 million inhabitants. That is a huge scale. And knowing that whatever intervention we are proposing, we have to reflect on what is happening in that history. And here, resilience, I'm going to reflect on it beyond resilience, beyond the term, from a political subjectivity, from having a history of post-colonial injustices and contradicting frameworks in play, and what kind of ecosystems that we are facing, and hence how people navigate that very sophisticated ecosystem in order to inhabit the city. And here I'm gonna to reflect on that. The focus is about the urban human. Here it is a matter of cross-sectional across social classes, race, gender, religion. So I'm going to give you a very simple story that can, from it, we can reflect on a lot of issues. So back in 1998, one of the very famous developer gathered a group of Copts in Heliopolis Club, and promoting that he will build a gated community in at the outskirts of Cairo. That time it was New Cairo, it was complete desert, and tried to manipulate them that if they come and join, he will build a church in it. And that was unprecedented, to have a church inside a gated community. And that should not pass unnoticed. Why? Because simply the developer played on a very particular issue, which is the right to build churches at that time. And looking into the history of building church and religious practice, I know this is a very sensitive issue, but it's very important to raise that the rule of it goes back to the end of the 19th century, goes back to something we call the Hamayuni rule, and the Hamayuni law, that you cannot build a church except after the approval of El-Wali or the ruler. And with that kind of law that kept on moving before, during the colonial era in Egypt, and then later after the decolonization of Egypt and so forth, until that moment in time, it required that there should be 100,000 registered citizens in order to be able to build the church. Having said that, the group realized, the Copts did realize that actually it might be a good opportunity to navigate into that proposal. Of course, going into the master plan, where it is located from the middle of the gated community to the edge of it, it's another story. But what is here important is that when you are left in situations completely as an urban human within structures that you cannot really challenge, you cannot really contest, what is left for you to navigate those notions? Of course, what then we realized that the notion of housing, neoliberalism, it creates a bandwidth of operation for multi-stakeholders and multi-players to play around. But also it tells us something, and this is very important from African cities, and how the thickness of time plays a role in it, how they take problems, obstacles, and jump through them. History is not linear, it's discursive, and actually how people navigate from one point to another is not a straight line, not necessarily. Every time there's a journey, you have to move around and take from that kind of reference points, anchors, to build new conundrums. Moving forward, inside that gated community, there happen to be social non-movements, and I'm going to use the term of Asif Bayat. It's not necessarily kind of registered. I mean, that particular one was registered. It was inside gated community, but was registered inside the Ministry of Welfare, Social Welfare, inside the gated community. So the complete contradictions of the world of private and private coming to conflate in that moment. But however, it became that people in general across religious backgrounds came together to contest any kind of injustices inside that gated community in terms of rise of market prices and so forth. The moment here, the evidence here is that we need to address things beyond just the techno-scientific solutions. We need to think about inventing the political technologies of making things happen, where people do connect, create conundrums, create sub-identities and different kind of affiliations that they are affiliated to something in order to make it happen, in order to make a church built, in order to make some sort of advantage in the everyday that they are struggling inside, because it's not possible to contest or to ask. So what I'm saying here is that there is a territory of intervention, but at many cases, citizens go into the extraterritoriality and create that kind of spatial expansion to try to move and maneuver the injustices that are in cities. And this is a very symptomatic thing that goes back to the colonial history. And without reflecting back and understanding what is happening at the level of the urban human, that then whatever we are projecting and proposing, somehow it will be used into different things. Somehow it becomes an anchor to something else. And that's basically, and I'm gonna reflect here at the end, I mean, towards something that Donna Haraway, a very important scholar, she's talking about the urban majority staying with the trouble. And here, the urban majority, it's the middle income class, it is the working class, it is the urban poor, that it is how they operate in the in-betweenness of things, in the in-betweenness of interventions that we propose, that multilateral institutions propose for the sake of humanity. However, how the immersive belonging in multiple affiliations by which humans register identities and organizations where things may work in one network and may not work in another. So people experiment in a constant choreography along the urban habitat. The idea is to transverse the gains coming from somewhere and retool it for something in another thing. And that's why we see mobility and this kind of movement from one place to another. There is no more that sense of the district, of the home. You would realize that the city is stretching east and west, and you have to invest here or here, make some connections work there, create an opportunity there. That kind of transversal mobility makes a whole different kind of understanding that the city is not static, that the structures are not static, the housing is not static because of the nature that people try to navigate and reshape new opportunities. So that's in a nutshell. I hope I made the point clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Momen. Now I'm pretty sure I need to read your paper. It's quite interesting the way how you kind of actually the narrative that you just presented to us and then how you weaved it is quite interesting, honestly, and how you took a case study of a gated community and having the church inside it. And one thing that came to my mind, like while you're talking about the gated community, is that are there any recent projects that are kind of a more newer development projects that have a different typology that have the similar case? So other than gated communities, like that's something that came to my mind just like that while you're discussing it. Mohammad, do you have and anyone else?
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much, Jawad. Of course, there are mutations in the gated communities over the past 30 years. Which are interesting actually to map. The notion of the land that is sold, that is massive, that cannot be built, so that half of it is left unbuilt and then retooled for something else. The negotiations, even within the fields of between developers and even between the residents, how they rethink of activities, land use. So that kind of reshuffling, it tells you that there is an uncertainty, and hence it's not resilient. Even these kind of long-term reflections and long-term planning modalities. There are different transformations that are happening, and we can see actually at the edges how the wall itself, the concept of the wall as an edge, as a vocabulary, spatially is transforming. We can see in an example where because of a crisis that happened in 2008 with a rock slide in Al-Muqattam, that a group people were relocated from Duwea to one of the gated community in concession with another developer to give them part of half the project, because it was created in alliance, in allegiance with that time Suzanne Mubarak, who was the wife of the president, the previous one, so the ousted one. So what is happening is that those notions of allegiances that then people were relocated into half of the gated community. Today, there is a factory inside the gated community. So that notion of circuits and transformation, people are retooling spaces and markets inside. So what happens around even gated communities is quite interesting. We see a matter of puzzles happening with land, with the urban poor, not necessarily following the same pattern of social lifestyle of the gated community. Nonetheless, they are staying at the edge in order to create economic base. So for them, for people, it's a matter of creating a base of operation to be moving around, to have a hinge, an anchor, point here, there, and then relocate. So there's a lot of influx mobility happening, which is actually interesting. And this is what I'm working on trying to make sense of what is happening. Thank you.
Thank you. That's definitely super interesting, and it gives us an idea of the richness of the urban landscapes and how people manage to make their lives. And I'm reminded hearing you of this very long conversation that starts in the late 60s, early 70s in Latin America, that slowly builds onto this entire conversation on informality, which I recently began to think about as an effort by planners to understand why the word doesn't turn out the way they want it to be. And so I feel that in recognizing, in John Turner recognizing housing as a verb, but eventually in planners coming in to understand how urban production happens outside the control of planners, because people have to survive, as Watson told us so well, right? While planners are trying to organize. So the question then becomes for this audience, what is the place for planners then in a context like that, or for NGOs? And particularly, I mean, I was like following you like an anthropologist until you told us we need to invent technologies for things to happen. And I kind of wanted to know, who is that we then? And is there a place where planners, international organizations, this body of even public actors intervene, or are these two parallel words that cannot intersect? Or are we bound as ultimately as city planners to produce the circumstances that people will appropriate, but we cannot actually work with them or do something that reflects a better understanding of how people live their lives?
Sorry, that was a question in general, like you were asking, just a comment. Momen, if you want to.
I agree, actually. I think when I said we, I felt like we as scholars, but also ordinary citizens at the end, right? So, but yeah, there's a notion in remaking and unmaking the vocabulary that we have inherited, even the planning schools, or even in our rhetoric when we come and talk. Things that we embrace, that we need to embrace, things that ambiguity, uncertainty, pluriversal solutions, that notion of informality as a static, a no-go, even the term itself is contested. A lot of things. So in remaking or rethinking a lot of the practices and the learnings and the theories that do not work on the ground. That notion of we want to calculate things, we want to have that sense of statistics, that sense of progress, that notion of development, that notion of modernity, it does not work. And in that regard, then it becomes an open question that I think it's an agenda to work on how we as scholars then adopt that.
I agree with you, Momen. Thank you for the presentation. And the we question, Mona, is quite an interesting and difficult one that actually would make every one of us here, because here we are gathered, all of us, we're presenting our solutions and how we deal with the issue, but how can we collectively move forward? I mean, because as everyone highlighted before, alone you can move forward. How can we collectively move forward? And the question of the pace of the planners, the NGOs, and what types of projects and how they are being developed is gonna kind of move us into the second, now the third presentation by Mohammad Asfour. And I'm gonna introduce Mohammad Asfour, and then we can enter a discussion about nature-based solutions and what we call city resilience. So again, thank you, Momen, for the presentation and for being here with us. Mohammad Asfour, as a green global citizen, Mohammad served as the regional head for the World Bank, Green Building Council's MENA and Africa Network. He was also a board member and chaired Jordan Green Building Council. He served as a senior advisor at the USAID Energy Sector Capacity Building Program and as the Environment, Water and Energy Sector Lead at the USAID Jordan Economic Development Program. Mohammad was appointed as an advisor to the Board of Trustees at the Princess Sumaya University for Technology and is currently the chair of Wadi NGO and a board member at the Jordan Train Association. He also co-founded the Ahl al-Balad, which is a non-political grassroots movement that aims at spreading positivity in the community through volunteering. Mohammad received his BA in business from the University of Jordan and his master's in positive leadership and strategy from the IE Business School in Madrid, and has continuously maintained a presence in the business world through a fourth-generation diversified family business. Now, Mohammad, the conversation that we had, all of us collectively, was one thing you mentioned was related to nature-based solutions. And the issues that you want to discuss, or the questions were like, nature-based solutions don't seem to be getting the attention that they require. And the question was, do we think that native plants can play a better kind of, or can better prepare our cities to face the wrath of an ever-changing climate? And also about, you linked us then to urban gardening. So urban gardening as an option, and how can it contribute to city resilience, and does it do that? So please all join me in welcoming Mohammad Asfour from Zertanau.
Thank you for the very kind introduction. Before I proceed with my topic, I've heard the word that I'm hearing a lot recently, which is the global south. I think it's really condescending when you use the word global north as if it is superior in a way to the global south. And yeah, just look out of the window, look at the pyramids, look at the Suez Canal, etc. So what occurred in a short period of time should not determine the way we look at ourselves. I think we need to believe that we are capable. We do not wait for anybody else's help, and we are able to solve our own problems alone. So that was the first point I'd like to mention. Okay, now coming back to city resilience and maybe the definition of the word of resilience in cities includes different aspects. It includes social, economic, governance, environmental, etc. But in my definition, I'll be focusing more on the climate change perspective. And having worked within the built environment globally for the past 12 or 13 years, I felt the focus on decarbonizing the built environment has focused a lot on issues that have to do with renewable energy, with energy efficiency. And I'm happy now the hall here is a little bit warmer. Because some emissions have been saved in the process. And now there's a lot of discussion about embodied carbon as well, which is extremely important. It's something we've been calling for a while. However, not much attention has been given to nature-based solutions. And this is an area I'm currently focusing on through Wadi, which is a national NGO that works on propagating native species in order to restore ecosystems. Now, this is related a lot to climate change, maybe not as much from a mitigation perspective, because our regions are extremely dry. And I do not think that by planting trees, they'll contribute so much to capturing carbon, but they could serve a great deal when in adaptation. So we, I think, have lost that connection with earth, with soil, and we have stopped seeing the role our native plants could play in our environments. So one of the examples of the role plants can do is, now we're expecting a lot of floodings in certain areas, and plants could help capture this water, reduce the impact on cities and human communities. The amount of dust we've been seeing because of the degradation of ecosystems can be also reduced or mitigated through planting more native species. In Jordan, for example, because of overgrazing, people don't realize that, but we've been having a lot of more dust in the past few years. So we really need to restore ecosystems to protect our cities from the negative impacts of climate change. Air pollution is another issue, noise pollution. So there's a lot we could do through reintroducing the natural world to the human world, to our cities and so on.
And
Yes.
Mohammed, currently you're working on a project about urban gardening project.
Yes.
Can you kind of just briefly tell us about that?
So I'm working on this project in my personal capacity through UN Habitat Jordan, and in partnership with the Greater Amman municipality. And the idea here was to go to a community in Eastern Amman that is underprivileged. It has a lot of refugees, as you know, a big percentage of Jordan's population comes from our brothers and sisters from the region. So there's a big population there as well. So we wanted to recreate that link between the community and themselves and soil and environment and so on. And so what we did is we chose this park. It's called the Queen Rania Park in a place called Nawara. And the first thing we did there was we announced this opportunity that a lot of community members decided to apply for, and we held our first 2 training courses. And as you can see, I'm speaking about these small communities with much more passion than a lot of the global work I've been doing, because I felt that there was a real, true, actual, practical result. So we had 2 courses of training initially. One was about composting, and the other was about urban gardening. I'll come back to composting, but first with urban gardening, of course, with the technologies available, you talk about different levels. Now there's the industrial level where you could use a hole such as this one to produce vegetables. There's the park level that we are targeting, and there's also the things you could plant in your home, be it on a wall or mushrooms in your kitchen or in your veranda or so on. So there's a lot of opportunity that people do not realize. Now, composting, on the other hand, helps in different aspects because we have a very big waste issue in our parts of the world. This not only would help these communities grow their own vegetables through applying composting, the different, of course, there are many different methods of composting. So they could also help reduce the waste that the municipality needs to deliver. And I think what we saw through this experience is how people got together. And to tell you the truth, I had no previous experience about bringing people from so many different backgrounds in one room and expecting them to be dedicated, passionate, and disciplined. But this is what really happened. They were so passionate. We created a WhatsApp group, and every day I'm seeing messages. They're going back to the park to check what had happened to the compost they started working on, what they're planning for the. Now I'm trying to get some funding from a private company as well to present them with small units where they could use worms in composting their own food, so that their own compost that they could produce their own food. So as you can see, there's an economic aspect, there's a social aspect, and there's also an environmental aspect. So what we're trying to do also within the garden itself is to identify native species of economic value. So we've got something called sumac, for example, which is really used, but it grows in that same area. But people were using the park to plant species that were imported from South America, Australia, I don't know what, although this could be planted here and could, another plant is carob, for example, which is drought tolerant and so on. So we tried to bring back the natural world to these communities in order to help them develop economically, socially, and environmentally.
Well, thank you, Mohammad, for kind of sharing this with us. And one point that's stemming out is practicality. So there's practicality on a larger scale, and there's on a smaller scale. And maybe if you don't mind, panelists, like I want to move forward to Wijdan's presentation, because then after that, I will give you the clicker. After that, Mona, Fawaz
will I answer the practicality point or later?
I think I want to leave it to the end of the conversation, because after Wijdan's presentation, we're gonna end with a conversation with Mona Fawaz regarding the scales of what do you call resilient, the scale of resiliency. Is it applied on a scale, kind of a local level, on a small gardening scale, or on a scale of a master plan, or a global scale? So without further ado, I want to thank you again, Mohammad, for sharing this with us. And now I want to اللي بعديها كمان وجدان. Next. I want to introduce Wijdan. So, Wijdan, no one shared with me your biography. Honestly, I couldn't
Shared it
find it. But
online.
what I want to tell you, what I know is that
It's very short.
you are a civil engineer with a master's degree, and also you are the CEO of the Green Building Council in Palestine. I'm pretty sure that most of us here are aware what the Green Building Council does, but it would be nice if you can tell us briefly about the Green Building Council and what you're doing, and the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you. تمام. I will be switching to Arabic, guys. So I would prefer يعني as a change كمان. أنا اسمي وجدان الشريف. أنا مهندسة مدنية ومعي ماسترز ديجري بالبزنس أدمنستريشن. أنا كو-فاوندر للمجلس الفلسطيني للأبنية الخضراء من 2011 وبنشتغل بفلسطين من 2011 على نحاول إنه نخلق capacities، نعمل بناء قدرات بالسوق الفلسطيني، لنخلق كمان فرص عمل ونرفع مستوى المواصفات بفلسطين. الوضع القانوني لنا إنه إحنا NGO. الكيس ستادي اللي بدي أحكي عنها هي الحلو فيها إنها هي بتجمع بين الريزيلينس للبيلدينجز وموضوع الكلايمت تشينج. فمع إنه الحالة الدراسية اللي إحنا ماخدينها هون، طبعاً إحنا كنا معنيين نجمع داتا، يعني كنا معنيين يكون عندنا معلومات. فالحالة المشكلة اللي كانت عندنا هون إنه مخيمات الأغلبية ما بيدفعوش فاتورة الكهرباء. فتخيلوا إنه الناس لما بتدفعش فاتورة كهرباء إيش ممكن يصير فيها، أو إيش ممكن تتصرف بموضوع بالكلايمت تشينج لما يصير كتير الدنيا حر. طبعا أسهل إشي بيعملوه بالمخيمات إنهم بيجيبوا مثلا كونديشنات قديمة، أجهزة تكييف قديمة، أو حتى أجهزة تدفئة بالشتاء. وهذا الحكي بخلي سحب الكهرباء هائل، بيعمل فيلير بالشبكة كلها. يعني أحيانا الشبكة كلها بتوقع بسبب إنه استهلاك المخيمات. لما إحنا حسبنا لأنه الفلسطيني اللي عايش بالمخيم بيسحب تقريبا ضعف الكهرباء تبعت الفلسطيني اللي يسكن خارج المخيم. طبعا هذا من المس بيهيفيرز، يعني التصرفات اللي نتجت عن انهم ما بيدفعوش الكهرباء. طبعا هم عندهم هموم اكبر بالنسبه لهم من موضوع الكهرباء، بس انه هم ما بيدفعوش الكهرباء وبيوتهم كثير سيئه العزل، كثير سيئه وضعها، يعني مأساوي. فلانهم يعني امبارح انحكى بالافتتاح انه اللاجئ مش زي حدا اللي طول عمره بالعشوائيات. اللاجئ كان عنده بيت على البحر، وكان عنده مزرعة، وكان عنده أراضي، وفجأة لقى حاله في خيمة. فموضوع الصدمة هذا بينتقل. يعني تدخل في المخيم كان كتير في تحديات. يعني مجرد انهم يقبلوا انه احنا نتدخل عندهم، هذا الموضوع كمان حساس، لانه بالنسبة لهم انه انتم بدكم تعملوا لنا ترميم في البيوت. يعني بعض الناس اللي بياخدوها بفكر صعب، انه يعني انتم قصدكم انه احنا رح نضل هون على طول، انه احنا لا، رح نرجع، لانه حق العودة كمان هون بصير الموضوع شوي حساس. فاحنا كنا كتير حذرين واشتغلنا. طبعا كان في اكثر من بارتنر في المشروع. احنا كنا مع سلطة الطاقة، عملنا الفكرة، طورنا الفكرة وتبنوها UNDP ومولوها اليابانيين، بس كل الشغل كان في الفيلد بالتعاون مع اللجنة الشعبية للمخيم. فإحنا ما تصرفناش ولا أي تصرف بدون إذن لجنة المخيم، ولا دخلنا ولا أي بيت بدون إذن لجنة المخيم. كله كان باحترام كبير للناس والموجودين، وكان في مراعاة كتير للثقافة الموجودة داخل المخيم اللي هم ناس محافظين جدا بطبيعتهم. فكتير كان في تدخل للنساء، طبعا هذا بشرفني أحكي. فالنساء أخذوا دور كتير كبير في الشغل بالمخيمات. مثل ما حكيت، بعد ما أخذنا التمويل واشتغلنا مع UNDP وسلطة الطاقة ولجنة المخيم، اخترنا 14 وحدة. هم كانوا 15، بس في واحد من البيوت أو اكشلي كان محل رفض التدخل. فإحنا ما بنقدر نفرض على حدا التدخل. وبقية البيوت وافقوا ووقعوا معنا عقود أنهم بيضمن تعاونهم معنا. الفكرة كانت كالتالي: إحنا بنيجي بنعمل لكم ترميم بيئي أو ريتروفيت، بدنا نقوي قشرة البناء عندكم علشان تخفض استهلاك الطاقة. بالمقابل الأهالي بدهم يركبوا عدادات دفع مسبق اللي هي prepaid meters عشان إحنا نضمن إنهم يرجعوا يدفعوا فاتورتهم، وبالتالي نكسب التوفير اللي مش بس ناتج على الريتروفيت أو الترميمات والتعديلات اللي على البيوت، ولكن كمان بنكسب الإدارة المانجمنت، إنهم بما إنهم رح يدفعوا بالمستقبل مش رح يفكروا يجيبوا مثلا أجهزة قديمة لأنها ببلاش أو لأنها رخيصة ويركبوها في بيوتهم. فهذا كمان يعني إحنا عمليا بنحل المشكلة من جذورها. طبعا هذا الحكي ما بقول إنه كل المخيمات رح تقبل فيه، لأنه كان في ناس عندهم insecurity بقول لك إذا أنا ما معي فلوس ما بقدر أشحن كرت، يعني أنا ممكن هيك تطفي عني الكهرباء. فطبعا في بس أنا بقول إنه الأغلبية أخذوا يعني كثير انبسطوا على المشروع. احنا طبعا عملنا مع سلطة الطاقة انرجي اوديت او تدقيق طاقي قبل التدخل وبعد التدخل في كل بيت، لانه هي حالة دراسية احنا بدنا نطلع منها على مشروع اكبر. وكمان عملنا مسح إنساني قبل وبعد. إحنا حالياً يعني عم نستنى، أخذنا شوي نتائج أولية على موضوع الأوديت، ولكن المسح الإنساني إحنا في البروجرس. بس اللي فهمته من اللي عملت المسح الإنساني إنه الرضا يعني خليني أحكي قريبة 90% مثلاً على التدخلات اللي نحن سويناها. إن أنواع التدخلات كانت إنه إحنا هذا كمان تحدي، كل بيت كان له كيس لحاله، كل بيت اشتغلنا فيه لحاله. يعني هذا البيت بده تغيير شبابيك بس، هذا بيت بده تغيير أبواب بس. طبعا إحنا ترميم قشرة البناء أو الريتروفيت اشتغلنا على يعني على ال 14 بيت. خليني أحكي إنه يعني زي فصلنا لكل بيت الحلول حسب المشكلات اللي عندهم. هذا البيت مثلا تغير فيه شبابيك. في هذا البيت كمان مثلا غيرنا كل الشبابيك اللي هي كانت سنجل جليزد او يعني ما فيهاش عزل، لا شبابيك دبل جليزد وعزليتها افضل. نفس الشيء غيرنا كمان يعني الابواب هاي كانت تشتغل كجسور حراريه تمرق الحراره من والى البيت صيف وشتاء. وهذا الحكي كان غير انه اصلا وضع العزل سيء جدا في هدول البيوت، فغيرنا لهم كمان من ناحيه امن. الابواب المالتي لوك امن كثير من الابواب الحديد. زدنا مع غير تغيير الشبابيك كمان عزلنا الجدران الداخليه، وهون كمان عزل داخلي لجدران. زدنا طبقات عزل. هون كمان عزل خارجي في بيوت عندها بس طوب، ما فيش عزل يعني الشتاء بفوت بشكل واضح كان بالبيوت، والعفونه تكون واضحه. عزل للاسطح كمان لبعض البيوت. حتى البارابيتس هون يعني الحفف اللي كانت تدخل المي عملنا عالجنا لهم اياها. شبكات كهرباء داخليه بالكامل غيرناها لبعض البيوت. والانارات غيرنا بعض الثلاجات لبعض البيوت. كان في الثلاجات بالذات كان لازم الاهل يساهموا ب 50% من سعر الثلاجه، بس كل شيء ثاني كان 100% مغطى. السخانات الشمسيه لبعض البيوت حسب الحاله طبعا وحسب كيف وضع السخانات اللي عندهم. وواحد من البيوت ركبنا له خلايا طاقه شمسيه اساس يغطي الاستهلاك تبعه بنسبه 100%. اوكي انا هون فحاليا احنا يعني قدرنا بس نقارن اوغست يعني احنا حاولنا ناخذ داتا عشان هذا الكونفرنس، ولكن اللي سويناه انه احنا بس اخذنا قدرنا نقارن اوغست 2021 باوغست 2022، وكان في تباين كتير كبير في تخفيض استهلاك الطاقه في البيوت، ولكن كلهم كان عندهم تخفيض استهلاك للطاقه. انا رح اعرضها اكثر في المسابقه. بس الفكره انه كان في تباين وواضح انه كل بيت كان له خصوصيته. وبالتالي احنا يعني من ضمن الريكومنديشنز اللي اخذناها معنا للستيج 2 ان شاء الله انه نعمل لازم انرجي موديلنج اللي هو اعمق بكثير من بس الانرجي اوديت في البيوت، فاساس ناخذ داتا واضحه انه تخفيض الاستهلاك الطاقه نتج من تغيير الابلينسز ولا الترميمات اللي عملناها ولا من الاداره تبعت البيوت ولا غيره. فيعني هذا كان التدخل. انا هون هلا هون انا رح اقلب انجليزي شوي. انا I wanted to stress on Luis presentation because he mentioned few points that I wanted to stress on. those were considered in our project, actually. So the home improvements, well, that's exactly what we did. We did the retrofits and the multiple actors with different agendas. It's actually climate change project money. It's climate change to support, you know, the resilient housing. So that was also interesting. The teams, we worked hard on building the capacities of the people, all the teams of the contractors during and before the works, on site and online. And we also, we kept the high standards. That was very important to us, and the dignity and the pride of the beneficiaries. Thank you very much.
Shukran Wijdan. And I think the scale that you introduced now to the session is definitely and not just the scale and how you connected it with Luis' presentation, because in the beginning, Luis was talking about in 2010 in Chile, there was an earthquake. So we're looking at a crisis at a bigger scale. And then we kind of move towards retrofitting and how do you deal with resiliency at the scale of a single dwelling. What I would like to suggest that, Wijdan, if you don't mind, and Mohammad Asfour, is that I would like to invite Mona Fawaz to kind of link those two scales together maybe and try to discuss it a bit. I apologize for everyone. Today, this morning, هي كان زي جلسة طحنك يعني هي شوي. There were not a lot of visuals, but what we would like is, I'm pretty sure we'll be short on time, but after that, we'd like to kind of connect with you individually, actually, to hear your opinion, because from all of the projects that you're working on can relate to the discussions that we're tackling here. So again, thank you for bearing with us, but we are a group who likes to talk a lot, apparently, and personally, I enjoy talking a lot. Now, without further ado, I want to introduce Mona Fawaz. Mona Fawaz is a professor in urban studies and planning at the American University of Beirut and a research lead and co-founder of the Beirut Urban Lab. For those of you who don't know it, please make sure to check it out. The Beirut Urban Lab is a regional research center invested in working towards more inclusive, just, and viable cities. Mona's research spans across urban history and historiography, social and spatial justice, informality and the law, land, housing, property and space, as well as planning practice, theory, and pedagogy. She is the author of over 60 scholarly articles, books, sections, and reports in Arabic, French, and English. She has also worked as a consultant advising on urban and regional development, housing, land, and property issues. In addition, Mona has been tightly involved in Beirut's ongoing transformations by publishing in the local press and speaking in numerous local venues where she advocates for upgrading informal settlements, protecting the urban commons, improving urban livability, adopting more inclusive planning standards, and more generally defending the right to the city for the urban majorities. Now, before I hand it to you, Mona, again, we were put on the slide. As all of us on this panel discussion, we were wondering, how do we connect with each other? What do we talk about resiliency? Because all of us here, yesterday, today, and tomorrow, we're gonna all tackle resiliency. But how are we tackling resiliency from our own lens? So Mona, as I mentioned, now she's not just a city planner, she's a citizen in her community who's playing an important role in kind of pushing this, not just this term, but the term for me is the right to the city. And Mona, one of the things, the questions that stemmed out during the conversation, and all of us, and again, why do we speak of resilience as city planners? And the question would be, to what extent is it possible to discuss resilient housing in cities of the regions devastated by financializations of housing and land? And last but not least, how can we connect the scales of resiliency? Like, is resilient housing achieved the scale of the unit as like Wijdan was showing us, or is it different from thinking urban resiliency more widely? So again, please everyone join me in welcoming Mona Fawaz.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Jawad. And really, it's a hard act to follow with very concrete interventions and valuable thoughts on and experiences on what resiliency is. But I think I just want to start by reacting to our use of this word resiliency. And it seems to me that every few years we come with a word, whether it's informality or sustainability. For scholars, it's critical thinking. For planners in the last decade, it's resiliency. And on the one hand, maybe there's tendency to say, okay, they're going again with their lingo. But on the other, I think there's something very real. We live in a world devastated by crisis and overlapping crisis, and we are grappling with these crises, and we're looking for ways and modes of first thinking and then intervening through that word. And it seems that the term resiliency has made its way from engineering first, right? Because it's engineers who used resiliency throughout the 70s and the 80s, and they had models for how to measure disturbances, at what point would a mechanism go back to rebound to its original state or not. These were concepts that were very technical, that were used by engineers, and somewhere in the 80s made their way into ecology. And again, for ecologists, for biologists, it was always about how big of a difference can we arrive before we lose the ability, how big of a magnitude should a shock be before we lose a magnitude to an ability to rebound. So resiliency, again, was extremely technical. And so then we import it into planning, and planning is about telling people how they should live their life. It's about working with people about how they should govern their cities. And then it becomes very social, and there's no social without political. And at that point, we need to begin to ask, why do we want resiliency in the first place? And what does it mean? And for whom? And to what extent? And there is a lot of social calculus that happens in it. One of the things that I keep hearing is this idea that it's a natural disaster. And we deal then with, especially because planners really imported resiliency in relation to big projects, and cities began to do resiliency plans. And so there's a mitigation plan, there's an adaptation plan, but there's also a crisis response plan and a long-term vision. And these plans keep always referring to the disaster as if it's like a natural thing. And there's this very famous paper that I would really encourage everyone to read. It's short. It was written after Katrina in 2006 by Neil Smith, by the late Neil Smith. And he said there's no such thing as a natural disaster. Of course, he's not saying there's no earthquakes and there's no floods. What he's trying to say is that causes, effects, how prepared we are, who will be affected, and who will recover is deeply embedded in our social political structures. And we know now, there's tons of paper, that crisis hits the more vulnerable more. So in this context, I guess what I wanted to point out to in this conversation is that we're coming all together in different ways and from different entry points to try and understand or think about how do we respond to the crisis that we are facing as societies. And it's again, maybe to the risk of like repeating myself yesterday, I think it's really important that we recognize that we can't think of climate outside of the other crises that are happening at the same time. And yesterday I spoke a lot about this idea of you can't speak about addressing the housing issue without thinking about the fact that people who are looking for housing are competing with multinational corporations who are looking to invest their capital. So if we add to this the fact that we are trying to put in place resiliency plans in a context where the we, and that's the point that we are all trying to put here, the we is not trusted. Our governments are not trusted to do the plans. And in this context, we know a lot from the experience of Katrina in the United States, that the main impediment for recovery was that people didn't trust their municipality, that the African-American community was actually alienated and didn't trust the city authorities. And that's again what we saw in Beirut in the aftermath of every single recovery. And what has happened, and maybe we have in Lebanon a specialization in crisis and recovery and war and repeat, is that every single crisis has actually consolidated the effects of the triggers of the explosion itself, the trigger of the earthquake itself, the trigger of any of the things that have actually affected us. And I think this is very important to reflect on, because when we use the concept resiliency, if we imagine that it's simply about absorbing, then the Lebanese society is an amazing society that has absorbed so much. But if we look at what we've become and the kind of rift that exists across different community groups, and the fact that when the last big Beirut blow up happened in August of 2020, we had just finished a $2 million World Bank sponsored city resiliency plan that was in the drawer of the municipality of Beirut. And you guys know what the municipality of Beirut did in August 2020? Nothing for a week. And after a week, when volunteers were collecting trash, were helping people clean up their homes, the municipality began to do what the NGOs were doing. They began to distribute brooms to help the activists, the residents, the citizens, the city dwellers, they weren't even activists, actually clear up the rubble. What I'm trying to say is that if we don't look at it as also a process through which we have to create a collective that has custody over its cities, its neighborhoods, it's impossible to have a resiliency plan that works. And that requires building that we in forms of collective that may be more creative than the modern nation state in contexts where the modern nation state alone has not been able to deliver. How this happens, I'm not really sure. We're definitely experimenting with some projects, certainly not by saying leave out the institutions of the state completely. They tried it in Beirut, and I think it's a big failure. They tried it in Haiti, and it's a disaster, so we're not unique. We're seeing it in other contexts as well in the region. So I'll stop here, but it's really a provocation to think about the climate crisis as first, yes, man-made, but embedded in a context where also the financial crisis, the overlapping global political crisis, the crisis of governance are coming together to make it much harder to address the issues that face us as societies in our very survival. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mona, for kind of weaving this through. And particularly, it was interesting how you kind of gave that timeline of resiliency and how it was utilized from an engineering perspective, ecology, and then found its way to planning. Now, back to the we question. I mean, this is something now that you kind of just planted at the beginning of the session, and now we're going back to it. Actually, I want to ask if the panelists, they have any comment regarding the we and regarding basically the process of collecting, of creating a collective and building the we is something that should be addressed. If any of the panelists would like to discuss, and then afterwards, I want to open it up to the audience for them to also reflect with us on this topic. Mohammad.
Thank you. Now, in the bio, when you introduced me, you mentioned something called Ahl al-Balad, which I did not mention here. So Ahl al-Balad was a non-political youth movement to help clean litter in the country. And then it developed into a way through which we could spread positivity in society through volunteering. Now, the word Ahl al-Balad in Arabic means the people of the place. So the first thing we defined here is that people of the place could be people who have been here for 100 years, or they could be here for 1 year. It doesn't matter. As long as you're part of the city, you have a responsibility towards the city. In our communities, we always have this tendency to blame the other. They haven't done enough to help us. From our perspective, we look at it as a shared responsibility. There's a responsibility for the municipality. There's also a responsibility for the people living in the city. So we can't always just expect people to help us without us also contributing to the process. And I think the first campaign we waged was called البلد نظيفة بأهلها. So the source of cleanliness is the people. other NGOs, other government bodies. It's where we feel that the we prevails. It's not us and them. They are us. Yani, I could be sitting here today, tomorrow I'll be serving the government. I don't know. Same as you. We need to stop this them and us perspective and work together towards serving the whole community.
I mean, it's hard to reflect after that very eloquent. I think there's a lot to unpack, actually. One of which is our frames of reference. I mean, frames of reference and frameworks. I think there's a human instinct to find solutions, to solve things, and that kind of rapid mode is problematic. I think the we question is important. We as not just a matter of we, who, us and them, it's more than that. It's philosophical, actually. It's about ethical, a question of ethics, question of the political, a question that transcends multiple layers and different scales. And I think that is a room for thought, and actually open it for the audience after all the comments. And thank you.
I want to invite the audience. If we have any questions from the audience, that would be great to kind of hear. Please go ahead. Okay. Is Dick?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Very interesting and very insightful. My question is for Wijdan. Working in the camps and doing these interventions for selected homes, and we know these are very closely knit communities. Did you see or notice any signs of, let's say, positive jealousy? Like, were other people coming to you and saying, I want this or I want that? Or were the owners of the homes with interventions proud enough to go and tell everyone like about their experience?
Yes, actually, the selection process was very complicated. So we didn't really choose the poorest people. We chose the people with the highest consumption of electricity. And it was very complicated. So we started with a list of 50 people and they reached 15 then. So actually many people wanted more of our intervention. To be honest, there are many people on the waiting list if we want to continue in the same camp. And unfortunately, they were sharing my numbers. So I kept receiving calls from people who wanted the intervention, because the selection process was, it kept the dignity. We're not choosing actually the poorest. Although we want to choose, I wish that we can reach a point where we can just retrofit the whole place, the whole camp. But until now, we have to do that for a limited number of people, because we have limited budget. So the selection process, actually the people were happy, and I can tell that we had a documentary, so you can see people speaking about the interventions. So if they feel shy, they would refuse to come up in front of the camera and speak about our interventions. So yes, I believe that there was some positive jealousy, and I believe that more people are on the list. But I think in the future, inshallah, we'll be moving to another camp, because we want to use use our experience in increasing the number of camps, so that we increase the number of people who are willing to have our interventions within. So, inshallah.
Maybe we can take one final question before we wrap it up. Again, I apologize that we took a long time for discussing the issues, but clearly it seems super interesting for us. I hope you enjoyed it also. But maybe if we don't have any question, I can say thank you to all the panelists again for being here with us. Thank you, Mohammad, Momen, Muna, and Wijdan. And thank you for Habitat for Humanity, more specifically Marwa and Dina for kind of helping out in everything. And thank you all and the virtual audience for being here with us. Thank you so much.